A radical wake-up call for a complacent elite. That's how a new book, How the West Was Lost, describes itself. Its Zambian-born author has already made waves by denouncing Western aid to Africa. Now Dr. Dambisa Moyo, an alumnus of Goldman Sachs and the World Bank, is warning that if nothing changes in the West, then fiscal incontinence and irrational investment means America might well end up the next century as a second-division socialist state born of desperation and a society rapaciously feeding upon itself. Moyo lays out 4 possible futures, only one of which offers much hope from the perspective of the US. First, the status quo scenario, where the West goes on as before. The emerging economies like China save where we consume, invest productively while we act as global policemen. In that case, we lose the economic war. Second possibility, China falters. In this scenario, they fail to maintain the 10% annual growth needed to overtake America. Instead, they're engulfed by the growing pains of a command economy attempting to innovate and evolve, and the West stays dominant by default. Third, America fights back. It redirects vast sums into new technologies and better education. At the same time, it reduces its debt-financed consumption. But all this requires money that Moyo concludes America has squandered already. Which leads to option 4, protectionism. Moyo points out that America has not benefited from globalization and will be harmed far less than its main competitors by a debt default. Despite being the nuclear option, of the 4, this ends up being the most likely. Well, I'm joined now by Dambisa Moyo herself and also by the American economist Irwin Stelzer from the Hudson Institute. Both of you, first of all, Dambisa, you seem to be suggesting that America's a busted flush because it's probably incapable of radical change at this stage.
Quite the contrary, actually. My book is essentially claiming and arguing that the United States and Europe have a chance to turn things around. If you read the second part, the subtitle of the book is 50 Years of Economic Folly and the Stark Choices Ahead, specifically because there are choices that should be made that could actually avert the impending doom.
But you do give some very stark choices. You talk about defaulting on the debt as one. You talk about a move to protectionism, which you say is not an ideal scenario. You wouldn't choose it. But actually, that might be an option.
Well, first of all, both default and protectionism are options. And in the case of protectionism, the reality is that most countries around the world, including Britain, including the United States, do participate and engage in protectionism. I mean, the case of Africa and subsidies against agriculture products from the African continent is a case in point. So I think we need to put that on the table first and foremost. I think that also the notion that somehow protectionism is only linked to China and their manipulation of the currency is something that needs to be dispelled.
Irwin Stelzer, do you think this is a cataclysmic view?
I think it's excessively cataclysmic. I do think that the book does lay out some very serious problems we face and I'm glad to hear that you think there's a possibility of redemption at this point.
Always.
Yeah, and the interesting thing to me is that I think what it does is it downplays the problems China has. For example, in healthcare, they don't have a system now. They're going to have to build one, very expensive. But it mentions that the West has expensive healthcare. So I think there's a kind of imbalance. And in the end, I guess what troubles me the most is the feeling that it's going to take massive government to fix things. Take infrastructure, for instance, which quite correctly you point out is in need of help. There's no reason why the private sector can't do infrastructure, and given the deficit problems, probably makes sense.
So the state capitalism model.
Well, I think let's just take the example of infrastructure. I mean, we know that private sector actors have stepped in the United States. Warren Buffett was a very public and loud cry of his involvement in the private sector around infrastructure. But that being said, infrastructure by and large is a public good in the sense that we all benefit from roads, but no one person necessarily wants to underwrite it. In the context of the United States in particular, I would argue that there are some very clear public goods such as education and infrastructure and issues around the energy question that the government should be taking a lead, although I do argue the private sector it needs to be involved very heavily.
But cheer up. I mean,
I'm elated.
If you look at, for example, the deficit problem, I don't think there's any question that in the past several months we've come a long way to confronting the problem. Not only because the election, I think, sent a message that the American people are concerned about it. They don't say what to do about it, but it shows they're concerned about it. And we have a presidential commission which has a pretty sensible report. Everybody knows you're going to have to raise taxes some and cut spending some, and that we have to do it, and that we can do it. So we have a policy problem that I think is in the process of being solved, and the same thing with education. We know what we have to do. It's a question of doing it.
I think quite the contrary, actually. I think that one of the problems, not just in the United States, but across Europe, is that the political cycles encourage governments to focus on what I'd call tactical problems. So deficit financing is a very urgent and immediate problem. Things like infrastructure, like education, are somewhat intractable in the sense that they are much longer and tend to be solved over a long period of time.
Would you think Donald is actually being quite complacent then about the problem?
Yeah, absolutely. And
what about optimistic? Wouldn't you prefer optimistic to complacent?
I think there's a sense of complacency that it just pervades the political system. And in fact, I might add that I do think that many policymakers are acting quite rationally. They are courting and catering to the political system, which does not reward politicians for trying to solve structural problems. It rewards them for trying to deal with tactical issues.
So you're one of the complacent elite rather than the optimistic elite.
Well, first of all, I'm hardly elite, and second of all, I'm hardly complacent. But I do think that, remember Winston Churchill said, Americans get things right after trying everything else.
But there may not be the chance to try anything else.
That's simply not true. I mean, China has huge problems. We have the rule of law. We have the ability to reverse problem quicker than, I mean, if it were true that that kind of system produces errorless things, we'd have a Soviet Union. We don't anymore. And we still have an America, and we still have a Britain. So I'm quite confident the democratic process will get us where we have to go.
Can I just say, very quickly, the reality is China is going to keep growing. It's going to grow faster than Western countries. The jury is still out on whether or not, on a per capita income basis, they're going to do better, because there are constraints.
I'm going to have to leave you arguing well after the program. Thank you both very much indeed.